By the time the fifth console generation kicked off in earnest, the first-person shooter was quickly becoming one of the most popular gaming genres, helped largely by id Software's Doom and its hold over the cultural zeitgeist. The promise of both Nintendo and Sony's new hardware ushered in an era where, for the first time, FPS titles would be playable in formats not too different from their original PC counterparts, something which had been attempted on both the SNES and the 32X and mostly been a failure. We commonly associate the best console first-person shooters of the fifth console generation with the Nintendo 64, but it's worth taking a look back at the first-person shooter library on the PS1, even though it pales in comparison to its main competitor. To be fair, there are some great FPS titles on the PS1, including a small handful of console-exclusive games that stand the test of time as genre classics. But most of the PlayStation shooters were also available on the Nintendo 64, and in many cases, the N64 versions of these games were also largely superior to their PS1 counterparts, which tended to suffer from choppy performance and control issues that made them lesser versions. Still, there were more than 30 FPS titles on the PS1, and this list compiles the 15 best titles that are available on the console, even if the superior version of many of these titles is playable elsewhere. Despite being one of the earliest FPS titles on the PS1 and having the unenviable position of going up against the stellar PS1 port of Doom, Kileak the DNA Imperative is actually a pretty fun first-person shooter, as long as you can get past its few pain points. Lots of FPS titles have cluttered HUDs, but Kileak takes it to the next level with a full health and shield readout, a display of your currently equipped weapon, and a full-on minimap in the corner. While it would have been nice to see an actual weapon model instead of just a crosshair in the center of the screen, the inclusion of the minimap immediately catapults Kileak to being better than you might expect, making the act of navigating its maze-like corridors that much easier. Notably, controls in Kileak are also fairly fluid and responsive, even if the simple act of strafing has no real value thanks to how cramped its corridors are to navigate. Listen, if you've ever played the PS1 version of Hexen, you already know it's arguably the worst version of one of the FPS genre's greatest early games. But when the foundation you're working with is as good as Hexen Beyond Heretic, there's still something to love about a subpar version of the experience, especially if the PS1 happened to be your only console and only way of playing this Raven Software classic. Unlike the superior N64 version of Hexen, which is probably one of that console's great shooters, the PS1 release of Hexen is a technical mess that struggles to maintain sub-30 FPS frame rates, which does little to alleviate the game's notoriously substantial challenge. End of the day though, it's still Hexen, which is a massive improvement over the already great Heretic, and one of the first FPS titles to really move the needle forward for the genre post-Doom. Despite what its abysmal review scores might have you believe, Resident Evil Survivor is actually not that bad of a game. General impressions of the title are that it's basically a Resident Evil-skinned House of the Dead, but it more accurately sits somewhere between a traditional on-rails light gun game, a first-person shooter, and a classic Resident Evil experience. And while it doesn't necessarily excel at any of these enough to warrant it as an essential game in the PS1's library, it's still a fairly competent shooter taken on its own merits. The game's lack of light gun support was a big knock against it at launch, but considering that the gameplay is more akin to the PS1 era RE titles or a standard first-person shooter, you actually benefit from getting to use a more traditional control scheme. The biggest downfall of Resident Evil Survivor is that it basically does away with one of the Resident Evil series' core mechanics, inventory and resource management, in favor of giving the player practically infinite reserves of ammo. But it's still a fun game, and honestly better than quite a few first-person shooter titles that made their way to the PS1. Although there's a strong case for the Nintendo 64 version of 007 The World Is Not Enough being the superior one, something pretty common among FPS titles released for both consoles, the PS1 version of the game is nothing to scoff at. Black Ops Entertainment did a great job making the game look pretty good for its time, and the shooting mechanics are incredibly solid, with a much more generous auto-aim than GoldenEye and a great selection of weapons that all feel fun to use. In what'll be a common criticism of a few games on this list, the controls of The World Is Not Enough leave a lot to be desired, including a needlessly cumbersome inventory management and weapon selection system. But the actual moving and shooting are pretty fantastic. and the spy-appropriate objectives in each level offer up enough variety beyond move from A to B and kill the bad guys to make The World Is Not Enough the one Bond game you would ever need on the PS1. Were it not for its few glaring faults, Alien Resurrection would rank a lot higher on this list from its innovations alone. For starters, Alien Resurrection is one of the first games to ever implement the now standard dual analog control scheme for console first-person shooters, which it hilariously got flack for from reviewers upon release. Talk about having egg on your face. Further, Alien Resurrection is one of the first games to blend survival horror with a first-person perspective, and it's interesting to see how much of the core gameplay loop revolves around carefully examining your surroundings, conserving valuable resources, and knowing when to engage or flee from enemies. Unfortunately, Alien Resurrection's high points get a few knocks against them thanks to how dark and difficult the game is, with a lot of the sequences boiling down to frustrating trial and error and the tendency to get soft-locked in certain sections if you aren't smart with your ammo. Otherwise, though, Alien Resurrection is a great game that deserves a lot more praise than its review scores might indicate. If we can look past the fact that the PS1 version of Forsaken should come with a motion sickness warning, especially when you're getting used to its oddball control scheme like I am here in the footage, it actually stands out as one of the better PC ports to make its way to the console. Unlike the PS1's version of Hexen, Forsaken looks and runs great on the system in comparison to the PC original, and it earns some bonus points for being a faithful one-to-one port, whereas the Nintendo 64 version is almost a different game entirely. One of the main draws to Forsaken is its inclusion of a multiplayer deathmatch mode, which a lot of other shooters on the PS1 completely forego in favor of focusing on single-player campaigns. Just make sure to keep the Dramamine handy for yourself and any friends you happen to be playing with. Codename Tenka is an interesting title, less appreciated than other Psygnosis games like Wipeout or Destruction Derby, but sitting right alongside them as one of the better looking and running PS1 titles in its respective genre. Codename Tenka is, at its core, pretty formulaic and simple. You'll start each level, a maze-like corridor, in search of a small handful of color-coded keys and a generator-type thing you need to destroy, then book it toward the evac point once that's complete. Along the way, you'll take out enemies using the game's signature weapon, a nifty little homing rifle that works great as long as you can wrestle with the game's control scheme. Other than getting lost occasionally and needing to wrap your mind around aiming with the shoulder buttons, Codename Tenka is a great FPS title in the PS1 library that looks fantastic and has some satisfying shooting mechanics, even if its strange control scheme and almost complete absence of music make it a little jarring to go back and play. No list of the best first-person shooters on PS1 would be complete without a mention of the console's port of Final Doom, purely from the sheer virtue of it representing some of the best and most challenging content ever produced for the original Doom. Like the PS1 port of Ultimate Doom and Doom 2, Final Doom comes to the console from Williams, and once again, they did a fantastic job porting a PC classic to Sony's hardware. At the end of the day, Final Doom is basically just more Doom, but the 2 megawads contained within are legitimately some of the best levels in the game, and the only fan-made content to ever officially get licensed by id Software. Together with the PS1 port of the original Doom, Final Doom also brought the full official Doom saga to the PlayStation ahead of Doom 3, making it the only console to have that distinction. Other than the id Tech 1 engine used to build Doom, no other first-person shooter creation tool was more important than the build engine, and one of the best build engine games ever produced is undoubtedly PowerSlave. This ancient Egyptian-themed FPS is really unlike anything else from the era in terms of its setting, enemy types, and weaponry, and the console ports were even further removed from other FPS games of the era by leaning into Metroidvania territory. Yes, that's right. Nearly a decade before Metroid Prime would blend first-person shooting and the non-linear exploration and ability gating of a classic Metroidvania, PowerSlave's console versions came along and did it first. Beyond its innovations to the genre, though, PowerSlave is just a great shooter with some pretty forgiving auto-aim, satisfying controls, and just the right amount of difficulty. I can picture it now. It's Christmas 1995. And I've just gotten the PS1, 3 months after its official North American launch. After putting in some serious time with Ridge Racer, I pop in the included demo disc that came with the first wave of American systems, and treat myself to a slew of playable and non-playable demos that showcase the promise of this new hardware. Included in that demo selection is none other than Jumping Flash, an atypical first-person shooter with a vibrant and colorful aesthetic and some gravity-defying physics. Unlike most other FPS titles of the era, Jumping Flash refuses to ground players and restrict them to maze-like corridors, instead setting them loose in full 3D worlds with plenty of verticality and mixing a significant amount of platforming in with its surprisingly excellent shooting mechanics. While it sometimes gets lumped into the early 3D platformer category, and understandably so, Jumping Flash and its sequel are, in my mind, two of the better and more underrated first-person shooters on the PS1. Probe Entertainment was responsible for not one, but two excellent games based on popular Fox film franchises, Die Hard Trilogy and Alien Trilogy. And while the quality of Die Hard Trilogy varies depending on which of the three games within you happen to be playing, Alien Trilogy is a consistently rock-solid FPS title that continues to hold its own as one of the best first-person shooters on the PS1. Unlike Alien Resurrection, which is more of a blend between survival horror and first-person shooting, Alien Trilogy is pure boomer shooter action, and it throws you into a wide-ranging series of iconic locations and set-piece moments from across the first three Alien films. But that's not to say it isn't scary, because it definitely has jump-scare moments. But thanks to a pretty plentiful supply of ammunition and some really powerful weaponry, shout out to the goated plasma rifle, the Xenomorphs never really stood a chance. Just like its predecessor, Medal of Honor Underground can almost be thought of as the PS1's answer to GoldenEye, and it's undoubtedly one of the better first-person shooters on the console. Perhaps its greatest sin is simply offering more of a good thing by doubling down on what made the original Medal of Honor great, but when you're working with a foundation as strong as that, you could hardly fault DreamWorks Interactive for giving players more of what they wanted. That said, Underground does offer some unique twists over the first Medal of Honor, namely the interesting use of AI companions during several of the game's missions, which only serves to add to the game's story about liberating German-occupied France as part of the French resistance. Probably the most important game in the first-person shooter genre, and the title responsible for popularizing it, Doom sits right alongside games like The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros., and Grand Theft Auto 3 as one of the most innovative and pivotal games of all time. Accordingly, there ended up being several ports of this thing throughout the years, and the PS1 version released shortly after the console's North American launch actually ranks among the best ports of Doom, making it one of the PS1's best FPS titles almost by default. What makes the PS1 port of Doom so special is that it doesn't just port the original episodes of Doom to console. It also contains Ultimate Doom and Doom 2, making it the most content-rich port of the game for its time. And if you've ever played any other version of Doom, it won't be long before you settle into circle strafing around demons with your trusty shotgun in this exemplary PS1 version. I've talked about Disruptor in the past as one of the PS1's most underrated games, but it's also a strong contender for being one of the greatest first-person shooters on the console, alongside giants like the PS1 port of Doom and the first Medal of Honor. Despite not many people having played Disruptor at the time of its release, the game's developers would go on to become staples within the PlayStation ecosystem, with Insomniac Games being responsible for some of the greatest PlayStation exclusives of all time, thanks to its work on Ratchet & Clank and Marvel's Spider-Man. But long before those titles would make Insomniac a household name, the studio's debut title for the PlayStation was the excellent Disruptor, a very competent first-person shooter with a compelling sci-fi plot, some buttery smooth controls, excellent weapon and enemy variety, and the distinction of being a PS1 console exclusive. Despite Disruptor being a commercial disappointment, the game lives on as one of the best and most underrated classics on the PS1. As the story goes, Steven Spielberg, who had long been one of the few major Hollywood directors to recognize the potential of interactive media, was inspired to help produce a first-person shooter after watching his son play GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. Combine that anecdote with his fondness for World War II history and his then recent work on the acclaimed film Saving Private Ryan, and you have the founding of DreamWorks Interactive and the creation of the studio's now classic debut title, Medal of Honor. While it's not directly based on a film like GoldenEye, Medal of Honor was a sort of de facto Saving Private Ryan game that put players in the shoes of an OSS agent as they fought their way through iconic battles and strategic locations of the European theater of World War II. Also like GoldenEye, Medal of Honor lets players do a lot more than just shoot corridors full of enemies, putting them to task with a series of level-specific objectives that really immerse the player into each stage and add more to the experience. Ultimately, Medal of Honor is the best first-person shooter on the PS1, and its place as a system exclusive only makes it more significant in the PlayStation's library. That wraps up our list of the 15 best first-person shooters on the PS1, which will kick off a series we're going to be continuing with other home consoles and the FPS library for each. Let us know your favorites in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.